Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back after lunch, those that have attended this morning's session. Now, this afternoon is on Matter 7H, which is on some of the other employment sites that are being promoted within the local plan, the submitted local plan. Now, I recognise there's a few other people in the room that maybe haven't attended before, or certainly have not attended before. I'm not proposing to go through an awful lot of housekeeping matters because, as I said, Miss Feeney has just explained about hands up functions and using camera and using microphone, etc. So hopefully, if you do have any issues in that, then please just state that you're having issues, and we'll see what can be done. Miss Feeney can sort that out for you. My name is Yvonne Wright, and I'm one of the appointed inspectors to consider the examination of this local plan and consider its legal compliance and soundness. I also have with me today as well is Mr. Warden, who is my other colleague who is working on this plan. Mr. Warden, if you'd like to, yeah, you've got your microphone on mute, Mr. Warden.
Good start. Good afternoon, everyone.
It is just straight after lunch, Mr. Warden, so that's okay. Now, I'm leading the session this afternoon, but Mr. Warden will certainly be being involved in the discussions and will bring in questions as and when he has those to come into the discussions. Now, just to let you know that we will be having a break mid-afternoon, and I anticipate finishing by no later than 5 today, but hopefully sooner. It just depends on how the discussions go. We may end up having a slightly longer discussion, particularly as we do have the benefit of Highways England being present here today, which we very much welcome. So thank you very much. Now, just before we or allow participants to introduce yourselves, I would just like to apologise for any confusion that I may have caused yesterday, particularly in relation to policy E13. I did make a statement there that the council, that because that site has already got planning permission, that the council is considering taking that out of the plan as an allocation. That is wrong. I do apologise. That is not correct. The site does have planning permission, so we will be discussing that policy today. Okay, so now that was an issue raised by West Horndon Parish Council, and they have been invited to attend this session, so we will be discussing policy E13 a little bit later. So without further ado, can I just go through the list of participants that I've got just to make sure that everybody is here today and so that everybody knows who is present. Can I start with the council, please?
Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is Paul Shadarevian, QC, acting for the council.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Inspector Phil Drain, Director of Planning and Economy at Brentwood Council. I'll also just introduce David Ubaka, who's a consultant working on behalf of the council on transport-related matters and is able to speak if required, dependent on the discussion today.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Inspector Jonathan Quilter, Strategic Planning Manager at Brentwood Council.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Inspector. This is Tom Huang, Senior Policy Planner from Brentwood Borough Council.
Thank you. And Essex County Council, please.
Good afternoon, Inspector. Brendan Johnson, Essex County Council, the local highway authority. I'm joined today by my colleague Mark Robinson, who may well be of assistance as well.
Thank you. And representations for S&J Padfield and St Mudwen developments, please.
Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is Ruben Taylor, QC, and on behalf of those participants, with me I've got Sam Hollingworth.
Mr Taylor, I was struggling to hear you then, so it may be worth you just switching your camera off, just to see if the audio improves, just for a moment.
I'll give that a try.
Lovely, thank you.
Is that any better?
Do you want to start again? Yes, I can hear you now. Thank you, Mr Taylor.
Certainly. So, sorry, I've been having terrible internet issues today.
That's okay. We've all been there.
Yeah, I'm sure we will again.
I'm sure we will.
With me, I've got Mr Sam Hollingworth from Stratton Parker with me, Luke Thurley and Ellie Evans from Volterra. Mark Flatman from Liz Lake Associates, and also Steve Cates, Mark from Atkins, who may be able to assist as and when.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Thank you. MM Properties, please.
Good afternoon, Catherine Williams from Savills on behalf of MM Properties.
Thank you. Estates and Agency, please.
Good afternoon, Nick Ireland from Iceni Projects on behalf of the Estates and Agency.
Thank you. Chilterditch Properties, please.
Good afternoon, Ma'am. Andy Butcher, Stratton Parker. I'm joined once again by my friend Paul Gibbs from David Jarvis Associates, who I will turn to on matters of Greenbelt when it comes to E12.
Thank you. Highways England, please.
Good afternoon, Mum. My name's Janice Burgess. I'm Special Planner with Highways England, and I'm also supported this afternoon by Nigel Walton, who will be providing any technical assistance if required.
Thank you. And West Horndon Parish Council, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Kim Harding. I'm a last-minute substitute for Councillor Thone, who is unable to make this meeting. I'm actually the parish clerk rather than a councillor, and I'm here really specifically to talk about E13.
Thank you, Mr. Harding. Now, what I was proposing to do was literally go down the list of sites in the order of our MIQs. So that would be in the order of E11, then E10, then E12, and then E13. Now, saying that, does anybody have, and I'm particularly thinking of Mr. Harding, are there any time limitations, or because obviously E13 won't be until right at the end of the session. Is everybody content with that order? I can't see any hands up. So is everybody okay with that one? Okay.
Yep.
I particularly want to do E11 and E10 first because of the transportation elements and the implications for the sites in relation to those two proposed allocations. So it would be very useful, I think, if we start there. So if we can make a start on policy E11, which is the largest allocation, it's the strategic employment allocation that the council is proposing within the submitted plan. So can the council just introduce that site for me, just do a short introduction as to the reasoning behind that allocation, and then I'll move on to some further questioning, please.
Okay, thank you, Inspector. So the site E11, Brentwood Enterprise Park, is situated in the southwest of the borough, and it's adjoining the A127 and M25. So the junction 29 of the M25 is on the north western corner of the site. And the site itself, it represents an opportunity in terms of strategic employment allocation, obviously bringing forward, as set out in the policy, 25.85 hectares of employment land, principally for office use and employment use on the site. In terms of the actual the situation of the site, in terms of the locality, as mentioned, obviously is bounded by the strategic road network on the western boundary. We've got the B186 on the eastern boundary, A127 northern boundary, and in terms of the approach of the plan in selecting this site, obviously it does represent an opportunity for a key strategic location in transport terms of achieving significant growth of employment, which would serve the Brentwood area. And obviously from our perspective, that's a key opportunity to build upon the stock of employment land that's within the borough and offer to the wider area.
So moving on to sort of the exceptional circumstances in relation to the Greenbelt, could the council just explain what those are at the site level, please? I know we did have a discussion earlier this morning that we will be asking the council for further information, but if you can just give me whatever information you have now, and we'll leave any further information till later.
Okay, thank you, Inspector. So the development of the site, E11, was assessed in the Greenbelt study as having a moderate impact on the Greenbelt. Whilst the site would represent a new employment site, part of the site is associated with the former M25 work site at junction 29 of the M25, and therefore part of the site would be previously developed land within the Greenbelt. The site, as mentioned, is bounded by the M25 and established woodland to the west. The A127 to the north, established field boundaries and Worley Street, the B186 on the east. And the southern boundary comprises a ridge line in the topography of the land, along which the public right-of-way also follows. It's expected that the site will be at a lower level than the surrounding countryside. And it's considered these particular local level characteristics are a factor that justifies selection of this site for release from the Greenbelt.
Thank you. Now I know that participants are present today who wish to talk about potential additional releases of Greenbelt land, but I'm not going to be talking about that as yet. So I am going to be sort of moving off the Greenbelt element at the moment, just for now, because what I'd like to move on to is site constraints and sustainable development in its sort of totality, and looking at that question in particular. Obviously, I'm aware of the statements of common ground that have been produced between the Borough Council and the site developers, and also the additional statement of common ground between the site developers and the Essex County Council on highways and transport matters only on that point. So can I just ask, because what we'd like to understand is the sustainability of this site in terms of its location and the sustainable transport measures in relation to its location. We'd also just like to understand the implications of any highway arrangements that may be necessary for the development of this site. Plus, and that's in relation to access, also in relation to any improvements that are necessary to bring this site forward itself. And that's impacts not just on the local highway network, but obviously on the strategic highway network as well, including junction 29 of the M25 and the A127. But also if there are any implications in relation to the Lower Thames crossing as well, and exactly what that means for this particular site. I know there are also potentially implications for E10 as well, and it could be that we, because I don't want to duplicate any discussions, if there are elements that need to be talked about and we have to talk about E10 in this discussion as well, site E10, I'm more than happy for us to have that sort of conjoined discussion about that, but we will have a separate sort of discussion about other elements of site E10 a little bit later on. So can I come on to the sort of the transportation arrangements, or certainly the highway arrangements in relation to E11, please? So shall I start with the council first? If you can just highlight what you think those are and what the implications of, or what is required for this E11 site to come forward, and then I can bring in the other experts within the room on that particular topic, please.
Yes, thank you, Inspector. Perhaps if I just give an overview, and then, as you said, others can add to that in more detail as required. I think, as Mr. Cross set out in terms of the general location and background for why this site has come forward and is being proposed in the plan, dates back to its original use as an M25 works site, which predominantly means that certainly a lot of it is previously developed, and I know that we'll come on to that in terms of general greenbelt aspects, but that is relevant when it comes to the reason for its location in the first place, clearly being close to the M25 off of Junction 29 and primarily having access that work site directly from Junction 29. Thereby being certainly a key part of the discussion that we've been having over the years with Highways England and Essex County Council, as well as the site promoters, to consider how the site can come forward. In broad terms, the council considers that employment on this scale for this type of likely employment use that would come forward is in a good location, well located, clearly for the strategic highway network from the A127 and the M25, as well as being part of the wider scope of growth that we've considered within the Southern Brentwood Grove corridor. So thinking about the wider corridor as it links to West Horndon Station in particular, and the opportunities for improved public transport hub there, and the way in which this site can be linked with that through what we've looked at through our sustainable transport vision work and ongoing discussions with the highways authorities about connections and such. In terms of that access from Junction 29, we, in promoting the site, in putting forward the site and considering the opportunities through the local plan process, and the promoters suggesting it coming forward, became aware of proposals of the Lower Thames Crossing, whereby the alignment of the Lower Thames Crossing Road changed to the extent that it then had impacts on the M25 as it goes northwards. In other words, up to and slightly beyond Junction 29, but including Junction 29, which was not previously part of the Lower Thames Crossing project when first published. That's more of a recent addition, recent as in within the last few years, and thereby requiring some works to Junction 29 in terms of how the Lower Thames Crossing route and flows of traffic from that access the wider network, in particular the A127 at Junction 29, which included a dedicated slip road from the A127 as it goes westwards onto the M25 as it goes southwards. If that makes sense, that's the arm of the roundabout as it's closest to Brentwood Enterprise Park as a location. The reason why that's important is because that essentially cuts off the current access road to the Enterprise Park from Junction 29, thereby requiring St Modwen as promoter to consider alternative access arrangements, which was then discussed with Essex County Council, and the opportunities that presented themselves from the B186, in other words, from the local highway network rather than from the strategic highway network. That is essentially a quick overview of the kind of access arrangements and relevance of how it relates to the strategic highway network. There are broader aspects that I suspect we'll get into as we start to discuss wider infrastructure, transport in particular, but I'm happy to sort of cover those briefly now in terms of what we've looked at as a requirement from growth to the around the Junction 29 and the way in which it links to the B186. It is relevant to Brentwood Enterprise Park, although not wholly caused by Brentwood Enterprise Park, the need for works to junction there and the general road layout because of what the layout is currently and the way in which we need to look at improvements to that as a result of wider growth. Would you like me to go into that now, or is that complicating things?
So can I, just so I'm very clear on what is, no, it's probably better actually if you do go into it now. So
no
please
problem.
Continue.
Thank you, Inspector.
I'll ask my questions later because I'll only backtrack and come back.
Yes.
Say it now.
And I'm conscious, as I often say on this topic, that I am not a transport consultant or specialist, and therefore my explanation may be quite basic. But I suspect for the purposes of the examination that might be helpful, and then we can go into the detail as we need to once we get into that.
We have the experts in the room, so
Indeed.
I'm sure they will add the complexity to any basic explanation you give. So thank you, Mr. Drain.
So as I'm just looking at a map as I talk through this, that might be helpful if others have got that opportunity just to kind of understand the references to road names and such. But as Brentwood Enterprise Park sits between the M25 and the B186 and the A127, therefore forming that northern boundary, the way in which you access the B186 in order to access Brentwood Enterprise Park, or indeed anything else that you'd want to as you come off onto the B186, if you're travelling from the A127 or indeed the M25 and having to go onto the A127 briefly to then access the B186, is essentially a situation, as we understand it, that departs from certain safety standards as they exist now from when the M25 was built, I suppose in the 1980s. You've essentially got two junctions that are very close together there. And that creates a situation at the moment which is not greatly desirable, although tolerated as I understand it. And I'm sure others will be able to elaborate more on that more articulately. But as we've looked at that issue, it's become clear that the increased flows as a result of wider growth, and I stress wider growth, although of course Brentwood local plan growth is part of that, and indeed Brentwood Enterprise Park growth is part of that. That then creates issues in terms of the weaving of traffic as you either are on the A127 or indeed are coming off the M25 onto the A127 and then wanting to access the B186. Thereby, we have looked at with our consultants and in consultation with Highways England, County Council, and indeed the site promoter, St Modwen, and others who have been very involved in this process to look at what solutions we can bring to that issue. And we've come up with a concept which you'll be aware of because it's published in the transport assessment work, but also published in the statement of common ground that we have with Brentwood Enterprise Park. The alignment of a potential link road that essentially cuts off the need for you to access the A127 when coming from the M25 and wanting to go on to the B186, and instead provides a link road to the north of the A127, and then providing the opportunity to access Brentwood Enterprise Park from that link road, which is we can go into more in terms of the access arrangements from the B186 direct and from this new link road. We've nominally called this the B186 link road. Someone may come up with a better name for it in time, but the idea of that is essentially to link junction 29 and the B186 directly, although not in two directions, I would add, only if you're coming off junction 29 onto the B186, so that you essentially we've dealt with the problems that you have for weaving of traffic on the A127, and you bring traffic through junction 29 before you're having that issue. Again, a diagram of the proposals probably aid to explain what I've just set out there, but I'm happy to come back on any questions or indeed add to the discussion as it flows.
Thank you, Mr. Drain. Can I open up the discussions to the experts in the room in relation to adding to the comments that Mr. Drain has made, so that we have an overall understanding of exactly what is required. We'll start to come into timescales and finances and viability and all those elements a little bit later, but it's just at the moment, just understanding what is required, particularly for these sites. But obviously we recognise that some elements of the improvements may occur because of the local plan growth overall. And I don't particularly want to repeat elements that will be discussed as part of matter 12A, but I think there will be an element of duplication just because we need to understand exactly what's happening here in relation to the Southern Transport Corridor and the proposed development along that. So Mr. Taylor, please, first.
Thank you very much. In relation to the highways package, you'll have seen from the hearing statement submitted on behalf of my clients that they've identified what they call a nil detriment highways package that enables the enterprise park to come forward whether or not LTC does. That comprises 3 elements: works to junction 29, which Mr. Catesmark will be able to talk to, but in essence deliver greater capacity than the enterprise park itself would require to that junction. Works in terms of an access via the B186 is the second element, and the third element relates to improvements to the Worley Street junction. Beyond that, as we've just heard from Mr. Drain, in order to accommodate growth generally, there is a requirement for a link road to be provided to address the weaving issue that you've just heard about. In terms of the essence of what then is required to deliver the highways infrastructure necessary to support BEP, that is it. It obviously includes capacity for growth generally, and no doubt we'll come on to aspects of funding and the like later. But hopefully that's enough in terms of explaining precisely what infrastructure is required. I don't know if you want me to go on to address sustainable transport issues and the wider implications of LTC, or whether we should just stay focused on the highways issues for now.
I think if we just stay focused on the highways issues at the moment, but I think we may well come back to those. Well, we will come back to those particular issues. And yes, you do make that clear within your hearing statement and the statements of common ground in relation to what is and isn't required to bring the E11 forward. So thank you for that clarification. And the council has made it clear that the link road to the B186 link is not purely a requirement for site E11. It is something that Can everybody hear me? You all went all.
Yes, there was a difficulty with the transmission. I'm not quite sure in whose direction the difficulty
You all froze on me.
You cut out as well, Mum.
Oh, okay. That might be a good thing, but anyway. So can I have in relation to this potential link road then? In relation to E11, it's not a requirement for bringing forward the BEP site, but obviously the BEP site would make a contribution towards that link road. Is our understanding of that correct? Just before we move away from the link road and start to move on to other aspects.
That's correct from the council's perspective, Inspector. I think just by the nature of the location of the site and the role of access roads and such, it's become almost part of the conversation about delivering Brentwood Enterprise Park, and the council's certainly grateful for St Modwen and Partners in terms of their efforts to try and solve some of the issues that we have together. But essentially, yes, it's a contributor towards that.
Would the County Council like to come in on the discussions there, or Highways England? I know Highways England is much more about the junction 29, but is there anything?
Happy to comment a wee bit, Ma'am. Just to say that yeah, we've understood all the link road details and such like. We accept that it's going to provide an improvement in terms of getting rid of the weaving and such like on the A127. What impact BEP has on it, we can't say for certain just yet because we haven't had that information. So whether they should be major contributors or not is we can't say because we just don't know just yet. But we do accept that it certainly would be an improvement on the existing situation.
Thank you. Mr. Walkden, please.
Thank you. From Highways England's perspective, the whole reason for the access road has come about as a result of the impacts of the local plan as a whole, not purely for Brentwood Enterprise Park. There's been an issue looking at the assessment of the local plan as a whole in terms of the merge from the roundabout, from the M25 roundabout onto the A127 in the eastbound direction. Now that merge has been shown to be significantly over capacity in all scenarios looking at the local plan. And therefore, if you can provide an access road from the access to Cotton Hall Farm at the moment and turn that into a dedicated link road to the B186, and that will improve the capacity for traffic to get off the roundabout and avoid the eastbound merge on the A127. Now, to date, there's been no consideration of the impacts of Brentwood Enterprise Park in isolation, nor the need for the link road from the M25 junction 29 purely for Brentwood Enterprise Park. And the link road off the roundabout is a one-way link only. It's an eastbound link only. And presumably, if an application came forward from Brentwood Enterprise Park in the absence of a local plan, they may want to look at an access which is two-way, as it is at the moment. So they may want to look at the impacts of access onto the M25 as well, which hasn't been considered.
Thank you. But that assessment work hasn't been done in relation to the exact impacts of what the proposed development at E11 would have.
Yes.
And the use of this link road, etc. That hasn't been carried out. Yes,
there's been no assessment of Brentwood Enterprise Park in isolation, correct?
Right. Okay. Is that proposed to be carried out? I'll just open it to whoever would wish to respond. Is it Mr. Taylor? Or was it Mr. Catesmark?
Well, I was just going to ask Mr. Catesmark to respond, if I might.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Mr. Catesmark, please.
Yes, Mr. Catesmark here. Just to respond on a couple of points there. The issue around the merge is because of additional traffic using the on-slip from onto the A127 from junction 29. Now, if Brentwood Enterprise Park has an entrance and exit only off the B186, then all traffic for Brentwood Enterprise Park arriving from the M25 would have to use that merge to briefly join the A127, then to leave at the Worley interchange to join the B186. So the nil detriment scheme for the Brentwood Enterprise Park involves retaining the existing entrance off the junction 29, so that the traffic for Brentwood Enterprise Park entering the site doesn't actually contribute to that merge. So that is why we believe we have a nil detriment scheme for the Brentwood Enterprise Park that avoids the need for that link road in the first instance. So while we have the entrance off the B186, we would close the exit onto junction 29 there to assist with increasing the capacity to accommodate the additional traffic generated by the Brentwood Enterprise Park. So that would be our nil detriment scheme. So in that situation, we're not contributing to the problem of the traffic, the merging issue on the A127. The triggers there are two triggers that result in that link road needing to come forward, and they are a combination really of the general growth and the local plan, background growth, the local plan growth. But in addition, when LTC comes along, then that severs that would sever the entrance from junction 29, which would mean the Brentwood Enterprise Park would then have to use the merge. But that is forced upon Brentwood Enterprise Park by the Lower Thames Crossing situation. So hopefully that clarifies the position.
Okay, thank you. I do have a decent map up in front of me, which is what you're probably wondering what I'm staring at, but that's what I'm staring at as well. And I have visited the site, and I do understand the on-off elements of the junctions, etc. I have been around that location and seen for myself the access points, etc., and the exit points. So I do understand the area, the locality in that sense, in that I have done site visits there. So I think that's quite clear. Can we just move on to the Lower Thames Crossing, because I want to understand the implications of that in relation to the BEP site policy E11 coming forward, etc. So can you just, I know what's been said in the statements, but it'd be nice to actually just hear that in itself. So Mr. Drain, please.
Thank you, Inspector. Again, perhaps if I just introduce it from a basic perspective, very happy for anyone to come in and provide additional detail. And I thank Mr. Catesmark for his clarification just now, which is essentially moving us on to this question, because of course what we've had to do through our transport assessment work is consider the situation with Lower Thames Crossing coming forward. That's a committed scheme, but also we've tested scenarios whereby it doesn't come forward. And of course what St Modwyn and the team are looking at is the way in which it can come forward now, and the timescales for Lower Thames Crossing coming forward in terms of once Lower Thames Crossing does happen, what the implications are and the timeframes for those implications, which clearly then create the situation whereby works at junction 29 would close that access to Brentwood Enterprise Park, thereby as Mr. Catesmark's just suggested, setting out the point at which the B186 link road may well be required, combined with the growth levels that would look to try and solve that problem that we discussed earlier. Our understanding of the Lower Thames Crossing situation at the moment, as we briefly got into in the December sessions, was that the DCO application for the scheme was being considered and would be in the public domain by that point. But as we know, that was withdrawn, and the Lower Thames Crossing team are considering that in terms of a resubmission of that application as they look at finer details. And so as we have our regular meetings with the site promoter, Highways England Essex County Council, we're also involving and have discussed with Lower Thames Crossing team the timeframes by which they see that coming forward. So I think from a very basic point of view, the implications of Lower Thames Crossing on junction 29 are effectively dedicated slip roads in order to in basic terms, to free up the flows of traffic through there without them stopping at traffic lights on the junction and such at various arms, including the arm that physically impacts Brentwood Enterprise Park.
And because of the withdrawal of the DCO at this point, has that affecting the potential timescales for delivery of LTC if another application is made?
As I understand it from our meeting this week, where Lower Thames Crossing just gave a brief update on what they're doing at the moment, I think, and please anyone correct me if I'm wrong, the timescales for opening Lower Thames Crossing are impacted by the delay of a year. I think before they were looking at 2028 being the point at which it opens. 2029 is now, and what they're looking at as a result of the revised DCO going in. I think they're looking again at sort of summer of this year to having that information published and being assessed. So that does clearly delay the project by a year. I'm not Sure, others may know more than me. I don't know whether the Junction 29 works as part of that are up front in the construction process or towards the end, as I'm sure anyone with, a basic knowledge of the construction that's going on, the majority of time and effort will be spent on building the new road and the tunnel. But of course, at some point they will be onto the way in which it relates to the M25 in the existing network and the works that will be needed at junctions such as Junction 29.
Thank you. So just reverting back to the implications for, and I will bring E10 in on this as well, just so that I have an understanding whether there is an impact on that site as well. The statements have said from S&J Padfield and St Modwen that there would be some impact, as it said, is particularly on the entrance to the site directly off the junction. Would it take up any other land area? Would there be implications in relation to the site area, and also like temporary in relation to construction? So I'm thinking about, does that impact upon the delivery of actually what is proposed in the plan on E11 and potentially E10, although I realise that's a bit further north of the A127. But if I could start with the council on that.
Thank you, Inspector. No, is our understanding of that. It's being done predominantly with an existing highway land, but will not impact on the delivery of either site. I'm sure colleagues may well be able to clarify or add to that.
Does anybody want to add to that, or is that the definitive response that no, it won't impact? Mr. Taylor, please.
Ma'am, just so that you're aware, I mean, there have been discussions with the LTC project, between the LTC project and my team for a number of years in relation to what the implications of the LTC scheme will be. In relation to the BEP, you'll have seen some objections suggesting that the site will be necessary for a construction compound. That is an objection based on out-of-date information. There are discussions leading to heads of terms at the moment in terms of the interrelationship between LTC and the BEP site. There are some issues relating to the diversion of a utilities pipeline through the southwest corner of the BEP site. Only affects a small part of it, and certainly my clients are convinced that their scheme can be phased in such a way that those works don't affect the delivery of the BEP in any way, shape or form. In terms of E10 is unaffected by any interrelationship with the LTC, other than in relation to the highways issues which we've already discussed.
Thank you for that clarity, Mr. Taylor. And again, just before we move off this particular point, in relation to E10 and this potential B186 link road, how does that, if in any way, impact on E10? Because obviously it would be in that locality.
Thank you, Inspector. Again, I'll provide an explanation and let anyone else come in with more detail. Essentially, the B186 link road, as is being proposed, follows the existing line of the access route that goes to Codham Hall Farm from Junction 29. So it is following the same road, thereby not impacting the site. As we've indicated in the drawings so far, we believe that certainly up to the point at which it then needs to link on to the B186 physically, it is essentially upgrading the road that is already there.
Thank you. I took that to be the case, but as inspectors, we're not allowed to assume. We have to hear it or have it written down. So thank you for that. And yes, I have driven along that road, so I understand which road you're talking about. So thank you for that. Can I move on to consider timescales in relation to the development at E11 coming forward, and then but also the requisite requirements to deliver E11, and then also timescales for the additional. We know about the Lower Thames crossing, so that's fine. But in relation to this proposed B186 link road as well, can I just start with the E11 and the timescales proposed for delivery on that site, and whether those are achievable and deliverable in relation to the highways aspects? That's that form of infrastructure requirements that do need to go in. I don't know if the site promoters wish to just come in on that point, or whether the council wants. So, Mr. Taylor, please.
Thank you, ma'am. The instructions I have are that the promoters consider that the scheme can begin to come forward within the first 5-year period of the plan being adopted. Of course, St Modwyn have a strong record of delivering similar schemes across the country. In essence, they're anticipating an application submitted in the autumn of this year, phase 1 construction commencing around 2024 and completed by the end of 2025, with phase 2 coming forward in the first quarter of 2026, completion in the first quarter of 2027. That's the sort of timescale we're looking at. In terms of the highway works necessary to support, my understanding is that certainly the site access itself from the B186 and the Whalley Street junction works can all be delivered within land that is either already highway land or in which my clients hold the controlling interest. And I think that is also true in relation to the link road too. So in terms of the delivery of those schemes, there isn't any particular difficulty anticipated that would affect the timescales for delivery. And in relation to the nil detriment proposals for Junction 29, we're already in discussion with Highways England about those.
Thank you. May come back to some highway issues a little bit later, but can I move on to sustainable transport measures to just understand how that integrates with the existing sort of infrastructure that is there and the infrastructure that's proposed, and how in sustainable development terms that would work, please? I don't know if the council wants to say anything first.
So I think the starting point has been for us to consider the way in which this site links to the wider aspirations of the transport vision that we've set out within the corridor. So linkages to West Horndon Station as a public transport hub, and indeed other stations outside of the borough, probably closer to this site in Upminster, for instance, to the west. Part of that has been discussion with the site promoters to bring forward the option for demand responsive transport links, bus links essentially. But as we began to discuss through the Dunton Hills sessions, the way in which we can bring forward more of an on-demand transport service to serve that site and link it to public transport outlets. I think we understand, and certainly when considering the strategy and the way in which we've looked to locate growth in sustainable locations near to public transport infrastructure and such, are conscious of the fact that this site, being more on the strategic highway network, further away from station facilities, for instance, requires linkage in order to help to promote that cultural change that I was speaking of back in Dunton Hills sessions, as the wider piece of how we would want people to travel to work, and indeed to limit the perceived potential impact from purely car traffic coming in and out of the site. So it's a combination of demand responsive transport and associated bus links that can be made through the corridor linking to West Horndon Station, and indeed where those who provide that type of service may well link to other areas, as I mentioned, Upminster Station potentially being a place that you could then link in the wider corridor and with other places outside of the borough and within the borough, and also the cycling links as well, that we considered as part of how you can improve cycling links through West Horndon, for instance, to and from the station, alongside the A127, where there are already cycle links up into the Enterprise Park itself, where I'm sure St Modwen and colleagues can advise that there would certainly be, as part of the site development and proposals in nearby connections, to be improvements to cycling facilities alongside the bus connections.
And can you just explain the realism of that in relation to the distances involved, and actually, are people going to cycle? Are people going to walk to this site, even if facilities are provided? And then we'll come on to actually what's proposed within the site and whether then that fits with a more sustainable form of development.
Yes, thank you, Inspector. Appreciating that it may be a bit of a walk. I was conscious not to necessarily suggest that walking facilities would be the primary way that people would get to the site, noting the distance, albeit we clearly would want to be improving walking opportunities in and around the site and the area more broadly. We think it is possible, certainly not too much of a stretch to say that you could cycle to and from the area, but I think the main thrust on getting people to and from the site outside of direct car use would be around the bus demand responsive transport opportunities.
Thank you. Does anybody want to add anything? Oh, I've got Mr. Harding, please.
Hello. Very interesting to hear that West Horndon Station is going to become a hub. The station is small, it is a rural station. It has country roads leading to it, which would need significant improvement, and I emphasise the word significant, for them to even accommodate a bus route. They do not have bus routes running on them at the moment. The country lanes do not even have footpaths running on either side of them. If you're thinking of cycling from the station to the Enterprise Park, it would be 2 miles, which I suggest is quite a distance for people to travel. Indeed, the Dunton Hills Garden Village proposals in terms of access to West Horndon Station is quite significant. I would suggest that there should be comprehensive discussions taking place with the train operator at that station, which is C2C, and they don't appear to have taken place so far. Also, the railway line is at capacity. West Horndon Station, prior to the coronavirus crisis, was regularly oversubscribed in peak time traffic and daytime traffic.
Thank you, Mr. Harding, for that. Can I have a council response on the points that have been raised?
Yes, thank you, Inspector. I don't propose to return to the discussion that we've already had on this issue through Dunton Hills. sessions, and indeed what we will go on to have in more broad terms. But just to clarify, really, we're not talking about buses necessarily going down country lanes to the west of West Horndon, in the sense that the main vision for improvements are linked to the opportunities to upgrade, improve Station Road as it goes towards Dunton Hills from the station and to the station, up onto the A128 and then using the A127. There may be opportunities on the demand responsive transport side of things to link not via that route, but that's certainly in terms of those cycle routes, walking routes if one chooses, to Brentwood Enterprise Park in particular, but allowing for upgrades there so that the station can become a hub, and that certainly has been discussed before, and is indeed part of the published evidence that we've set forward in terms of the vision for the station, the way in which that can be achieved, the role of the site that we discussed yesterday at West Horndon Industrial Estate and creating a new local centre there, and the way that that links to the station, and indeed the way that Dunton Hills links to the station. And I would just add that conversations certainly have been undertaken with C2C and are ongoing with C2C on a regular basis around a memorandum of understanding for the way in which that station will be upgraded to accommodate what we're talking about here, and potentially the other options for growth that are being suggested elsewhere. So that is something that we're very conscious of. The capacity of the line is something that C2C advise on, and then indeed it is more about the rate at which trains stop at West Horndon Station in terms of any busyness of trains at that point.
Thank you. Mr. Taylor, please.
Thank you. Really, the point I wanted to make about sustainability is to not lose sight of the nature of the development that's being proposed on this site. It is a development that would meet needs for large footprint employment space and cater for long-term tenants. That sort of development is the sort of development that requires the use of the strategic road network. And so this site is ideally located to ensure that there is almost immediate access to the strategic road network for the sort of transportation movements that this sort of development gives rise to. And that in turn avoids an impact on the local road network that would otherwise arise if sites were used were more distant from the road, the strategic road network, to cater for this type of use. So that's the first element of sustainable transport to consider. We would also support the points made by Mr. Drain in relation to demand responsive travel, and point to how well these proposals sit within the A127 growth corridor, and how it too will support the aspirations for a green travel corridor linking other allocations such as West Horndon, Codham Hall and Childerditch Industrial Park. And we would point you to document C37 of the Council's own evidence base for more information on that. Thank you.
Thank you. That brings us quite nicely on to the actual development proposed on the site itself. And I would like to look in a bit more detail on the actual policy wording. So first of all, I recognise that there is employment use existing on that site. Can I just have clarification on how much of the proposed allocation is, in terms of land use, is actually currently in use? So I know it's the northern part of the site, but can you just confirm how much?
Thank you, Inspector. I don't currently have that to hand. The site promoter may be able to advise.
Mr. Taylor, please.
Ma'am, thank you. I wonder whether Mr. Hollingworth might be able to assist on that. I can't find the number immediately to hand myself either.
If you've not got it to hand, Mr. Hollingworth.
Can I come back to you on that, Mom?
Absolutely, yeah. It's not an issue. We'll move on.
Numbers.
We need to move on. We've got a few more sites to get through. I'm aware that we've spent a bit of time on this, but I think it's important to try to understand. Mr. Ireland, please, you've got your hand up.
Thank you. I wasn't exactly clear on the questions around the timings of delivery and the interrelationship between that and the access arrangements from what we've heard. So I wonder whether you could perhaps clarify some of this. So my questions were, in essence, is all of the growth of the site able to come forward with the B186 access? Or is there a trigger at which point the new link road needs to be delivered and in place? Given what's happening with the M25 junction, is there an estimate of when that link road might be brought forward, and the timing for delivery of that, and also how that would be funded? And then related to those issues, has consideration been given to how this plays through, how the access arrangements and constraints on access play through to the pace of take up of the site, in that, for the types of uses that Mr. Taylor's just described, access is a particularly important consideration, and therefore would affect, I would suspect, the pace of take up on the site, and therefore have those issues in terms of the changes to access, the link road, and also the works that are necessary to junction 29 influenced the consideration of the pace of delivery and take up here.
Thank you, Mr. Ireland. I was going to come back to the sort of the cost element and the delivery of that nearer the end in relation to viability and deliverability, but I'm more than happy to take those questions now. So if I can put those towards whoever would like to respond, really. I have a couple of hands up. So are these responders to that particular point, or if I could get clarity on
certainly,
that? Is it Mr. Taylor? Yes.
Yes, I can certainly respond, and indeed ask others in my team too. I thought it had been made pretty clear already, but the position of the nil detriment proposals that are set out in the hearing statements on behalf of my client is that in order to deal with the entirety of the proposed development at the Enterprise Park, what needs to come forward are the three elements I spoke to earlier. The link road is not one of them. The link road is only required if the LTC comes forward, and at that particular point. So hopefully that is now understood. In terms of issues relating to access and how that might affect deliverability, I've already spoken about the extent of ownership and deliverability of the access proposals. I don't propose to go over that again. In terms of the position about demand for this site, you have a large amount of information on that, including information most recently with an update from Volterra, in which Volterra explained that since they looked at the position before, an update to the market information finds that not only has market demand for the type of space that will come forward on BUP grown in line with earlier trends, but the growth has increased as a result of the pandemic and a general increase in the market for storage and logistics as a result. So it's perfectly clear that obviously St Modwen have thought about very carefully about the timescales for their delivery in line with the the issues relating to access, such as they are, and the general increase in market demand in this location. I hope that helps answer. I don't know if Mr. Hollingworth has got anything he wishes to add to what I've just said.
No, Mom, I think it's covered in detail in our hearing statements, as well as Mr. Taylor's said, so I don't think I can add anything further to that. It's just evidently a deliverable site. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ireland, you've still got your hand up. Is that to make a further comment?
Yes, please, if I can. I think our point is not one of the overall general market demand here, which we very much accept. It's one that relates to the interplay between the access to the site, the significant works which are expected to, or could be required to junction 29, particularly if the Lower Thames crossing comes forward, and the potential for those factors to influence the attractiveness of this site in the intervening period. The point being that essentially, while this is it sits next to an M25 motorway junction, the potential for essentially a series of roadworks to cause congestion on the junction could inhibit, in that intervening period, essentially between now and what we've heard is 2029, the attractiveness of this site for those types of uses that Mr. Taylor has talked about. So it's that particular interplay between those factors that, in our view, would affect the pace of take-up of the site in the period between now and 2029.
Would the council wish to, or Mr. Taylor wish to respond back on that point? Oh, I'm not sure if we have Mr. Taylor present any longer. Oh yes, Mr. Taylor.
I am still here. Sorry, I know it's difficult with just hearing a voice.
I lost you from my list for a minute, but you're back on.
Okay.
Anything further you want to add? Because I do want to move on.
I'm just going to ask Mr. Hollingworth whether he has something that he wishes to add.
Thank you, Mom. Yes, I think that the point is that the pertinent point here is that the access to the site is very much achievable, and that has been demonstrated. You have substantial evidence provided by expert consultants from Volterra to confirm the market interest in demand. And on the flip side of that, you have pure conjecture to suggest that there might not be market demand with no evidence to support that. And I don't think, frankly, Mom, there's much more that needs to be said about the issue, unless you have any further questions.
I don't at the moment, but I'm going to bring in Ms. Williams, and then we'll, because I don't know what Properties wish to point us to or comment on, and whether it's in relation to this point. So, Ms. Williams, please.
Thank you. It was just in relation to the timing of the delivery, rather than the delivery per se, in that the Statement of Common Ground agreed with Essex County Council refers to, obviously, quite significant infrastructure works on the Whalley interchange, and particularly the fact that the bridge over the O127 might need to be replaced, and there are works required to the westbound slip as well, and the programme provided by St Modwen sort of doesn't include those works, and it just refers to, planning permission being achieved Q1 next year and pre-commencement conditions, etc., but nothing in relation to the potential delay or the length of time that those works could take. And I suppose one of the concerns that we have is in relation to, whether their timings for delivery, particularly in relation to phase 1, are realistic.
Mr. Taylor or the council? Who would like to respond on that point, please?
Madam, I can respond on that. Certainly the programme that you've been provided with is a programme produced after careful consideration by St Modwin, who have many years of delivering schemes such as this, highly experienced developers who have addressed access issues such as we face here. They've given you the benefit of their many years of experience in producing the figures that have been produced and the timings that have been produced. If Ms Williams can produce evidence as to why that timescale is incorrect in some way, rather than just asserting that it's problematic, then I'd be happy to respond to the evidence.
Thank you. I would at this point like to move on and look at the policy wording, because I would like to finish E11 before we have a break and then come back. E10 won't be quite as long as this, I will ensure. And then obviously there will be another opportunity to discuss certain elements where necessary without repetition wherever possible under matter 12A, and certainly in relation to the Dunton Hills proposal as well. So it's something that we can turn back to. So can I just have a look at the policy wording, because I've got a number of representations sort of made. I've got the policy wording which is in the submitted plan. I've got the suggested amendments made by the council in their F9A document, and some of that is on the back of the recent changes. Well, it was done in the autumn, changes to the use classes order, etc. So can I just have, and then I've got some suggestions made within statements of common ground in relation to further changes made by St Modwin and S&J Padfield in relation to potential extension of the land. Now, I'm not considering extensions to the land. We did have this discussion, or we have made it very clear before that we're not looking at emission sites. Now, if additional land is necessary to bring forward delivery of a site, that's slightly different. So I'm happy to have a discussion about that. But if it's to bring forward further development, then that's a completely different matter. To expand a site in that way, that wouldn't necessarily be acceptable. Now, I understand from, well, first of all, can we just look at the policy wording so I can understand the council's sort of reasoning behind some of the suggested changes, and to understand how that fits with the use class order. Obviously, this is currently a Greenbelt site. So if we were to find there were exceptional circumstances, I mean, coming to a point where there are exceptional circumstances is always a very high bar. It's a completely different approach when dealing with very special circumstances. That's a completely different approach from a development management perspective. I'm not saying that's still not a high bar, because it is a very high bar as well, but it's a different approach. Coming from the perspective of a local plan, I just want to understand how the council are going to ensure that if we as the inspectors find that, yes, there are exceptional circumstances for there to be employment of the use set out within the policy, and that can be utilised on this site, and it's been adequately demonstrated, and exceptional circumstances exist for this site to be removed from the Greenbelt, then how can we be, how can we have comfort that those uses would remain? Because obviously once those uses have permission and are on site, changes can be made within Class E without any planning application because it's not deemed to be development. So what we don't want is these to become retail parks, for instance. So, and I'm not saying in any way that that's what would happen at all, but we just need to have that element of comfort, and we would like to understand how the council propose, because this would involve removal of greenbelt land, how we can ensure that it remains as employment land. So I'm not sure who would wish to respond. Is it Mr. Shadaravian?
Yes, Mum. Can
Please.
you hear me? Can you hear
I
me?
can, yes.
Oh, good. Because I'm going to take you off my screen for a minute. And I don't mean that to be rude. I just need to look at the document.
That's fine. I
Okay,
won't. I take no offence. You're okay.
Okay. We've tried to approach this. I'm afraid to say the changes to the use classes order has really put the cat amongst the pigeons in a big way. And
I can't possibly comment.
I'm not asking you to, but that's an observation, Mum. You may or may not accept it. I'm not suggesting it's bad or a good thing. I'm merely saying that it's actually upset the apple cart a little bit, so we've got to readjust. And the way we've approached it here with the changes is on a qualitative basis. So, for example, we've been quite careful to specifically mention offices, and I know where your question was going to, is how we're going to retain this. But in terms of instituting the uses on the site and requiring them to fall within these categories, we've specified that within Class E we would like offices there, and that's it. And then go on to deal with B2, B8 development, and other subsidiary uses. Employment generation development, including uses within Class E as a means of supporting the principal employment uses. So I think in terms of establishing the parameters for the various uses which are being permitted here, not permitted but allocated, this does the job. There is always the difficulty about how you then, for example, in relation to the office element, how you might keep that as offices rather than allowing the operation of the use classes order to work. But that's a bit of a knotty problem in the sense that can one actually take away those rights by use of a planning obligation? And that, in my view, remains a possibility. But bearing in mind that the office element of this is likely to be only one element, and I'm not sure how big an element it would be in any event, given the location of the development and the way in which these business uses are going at the moment. It's more likely, in my view, to be more substantially or predominantly B2 and B8. I'm not sure that it's an issue that should cause us an awful lot of concern at the moment.
Thank you. Can we move on to some of the additional wording and some of the outstanding matters set out in the Statement of Common Ground with the promoters of the site who have suggested some other wording? I don't know if the council, you've had a chance to have a look at those suggestions and whether you have any particular comments that you feel, yes, those are necessary for soundness reasons to that the policy needs to be amended to include those, or whether you feel no, that they're not necessary and you're happy with what's set out in your suggested F9A, which replaces your policy in effect in the submitted plan. So I'll just go down the list, and my apologies if I miss any. But the use of the word ancillary, i.e. ancillary supporting development, and whether the use of the term ancillary is necessary. I think it's instead of employment generating development, using the term ancillary. There's an issue in relation to placing something in the policy in relating to diversion of the existing public way as a potential. Other elements under part 2, in terms of the structure requirements, the infrastructure requirements have been suggested that those be amended. And then I would like some clarity on the reasoning behind the evidence as to the provision of early years nurseries within the site and childcare nurseries. Now, you're proposing to, or you have suggested an amendment to change that to provide 2 separate areas of land. It's not quite clear, the wording isn't quite correct there, but for 2 standalone early years and childcare nurseries. And I just want to understand, I know that that's come from the county council is my understanding, but I would like to understand why that's a requirement on this employment site. And also just understand the issue in relation to the wording around 1C in your F9A, which is about consider the protection and where possible enhancement or enhance the adjoining local wildlife site. I don't like the term consider. I don't understand what that is trying to achieve in terms of Hobbs Hole. If it's a requirement that that site is protected, then it should say that rather than consider. And whether it's appropriate for this site to enhance that wildlife site, which it may well be appropriate, but could you just explain? That was quite a bit I've chucked in there. But could you just run through very quickly, please?
Can I start with the proposed? I'm referring here to Appendix B of the Strutton Parker 2021 document. Yeah. And Appendix B proposes changes to our proposed modifications. I've got no issue with the way in which the uses are described. I've got no issue actually with ancillary or subsidiary. I don't think it really matters terribly much. The point is that they are there to support the primary uses which are being allocated and not in themselves to supplant or become primary in their own right. So I don't have a big problem with that, actually. I don't think anything changes the sense of what we were trying to do there. So if you feel that you're happier with that suggested rewording, we're happy to go along with that. In relation to the use of the word considering, I agree with you. It's not a word I like in policies either, because it doesn't impose any requirements or refer to any particular parameters which need to be met. So I think if there is a need to preserve and enhance local wildlife sites or protect and enhance local wildlife sites, then that should be a requirement. I need to take instructions in relation to Part 2, infrastructure requirements, what proposals should do in terms of the early years and childcare nurseries. I'm not sure. Yes, Ms. Tom is going to deal with that now.
Thank you.
So in terms of the early years and childcare provision, we have had this conversation with Essex County Council as the local education authority, and they have been very clear that there is a need there as a result of the proposed development, and they require that the 0.13 hectares would be needed to accommodate the possible future needs in the future. So in terms of for the local plan purpose, we think that this requirement is sound and supported by the local education authority. Now, we understand that the developers have an issue with this requirements. However, we consider that it is something that they can bring up with the Essex County Council, because it's clearly it's not something that is outside the local authorities' remit, because we're not education authority really. So that's our stance, Madam.
Thank you. It would be useful to understand Essex County Council's thinking on that. I'm not saying that it's not appropriate for early years to actually be on an employment site. Actually, it absolutely could be essential. I'm just a little bit concerned in relation to, would it just be for employees within the site? Because if you're starting to encourage other people from outside the site to utilise those childcare and early years areas, you're encouraging car use. So there's a sort of sustainability issue there. So just some clarity on that would be useful with the County Council. Is it for the employees on the site only? That would, and whether that would be, whether they would be able to say it's only for that.
Our understanding. Sorry, Inspector. Our understanding is that it is for the site only, in the sense that there's not a huge amount of development in the surrounding area, and that is in order to make the employment uses able, therefore, to have that facility without then relying on having to travel outside of that area. But I think in terms of what we have just suggested, perhaps with the use of the word consider, for instance, where I noticed that's come back in terms of the proposed changes in Appendix B under the point around public transport. This is perhaps something for us to look at to make sure that we provide some clarity on what is being required here in this policy, and as part of that we can perhaps get a little bit more explanation from County Council as to why it needs to be so specific.
That would be really useful. As I said, if it's justified, that's not an issue to be in the policy, and it does actually make sense for those working on the site to have childcare facilities within that vicinity. That could be a real attractiveness for the for any businesses working on the site and for any employees. Mr. Taylor, please.
Thank you, Madam. I just wanted to jump in at that point just to explain my client's position, which is that there's no objection to provision of nurseries and childcare on site for employees. That the issue that we're raising is that it's just premature to determine that it has to be 2 nurseries now. And what needs to be done is to formulate a policy that allows consideration of what is required and justified at the time when the application is determined. And it's really that issue that we're raising a concern about. And just whilst I'm on, as it were, in relation to the issue about the wildlife site, we are struggling to understand why there is a requirement to enhance as opposed to simply protect the wildlife site, which is of course off-site anyway at this stage, and that's the point we're raising there.
Thank you. Can I have a council response? So Mr. Shadaravian, please. You're on mute, Mr. Shadaravian.
Sorry. We are of course under an obligation to try and seek wherever possible a net gain in biodiversity. So that provision does assist in trying to achieve that. Secondly, in relation to the nursery provision, this is intended to provide facilities for those who are working at the site. I think if Essex County Council is satisfied, then certainly provision should be proportionate to the need which is created on site. And I think probably, rather than using the word proportionate, we ought to take that approach instead. So we can think about what I will do is have a chat with my learned friend and see if we can come up with a formulation there that suits both the County Council and the intended outcome here, which is to meet the requirements of users of the development.
Right.
So far as the other proposed changes to Part 2 are concerned, our view is that the mods which we have proposed should remain in place. All right.
Thank you.
If I can just mop up on something which has been raised by Mr. Ireland and others. If there are hiccups to delivery of the vital infrastructure at the initial phases, it's not going to influence the delivery of this site overall in the way in which we have envisaged it to be delivered in the 2 phases. It is going to make the appropriate contribution to our employment needs, even if there are a few hiccups along the way. So we've got to look at this proportionately, as it were, on a strategic level. That's the only observation I would make about that, Mark.
Thank you. Can I just then come to the final sort of outstanding matter before we come to a break? So I know that I'm sure everybody's gasping for a quick drink. Before we move on. And hopefully this will take a very short amount of time. Oh, Mr. Taylor, you've got your hand up. Was that in response to some previous comments?
No, I just wanted to make sure that we dealt with the issue about landscaping and reprofiling to the north.
Well, that's what I was just about to come to.
Oh, sorry. In that case,
that's
I'm
okay.
interrupting.
Don't worry. Don't worry. No, it's always worth just making sure that we're not missing something. So thank you. But no, I was just coming to that point where in your representations and in the statement of common ground, you've provided a plan showing some additional areas of land that you consider should form part of the site allocation for access reasons, for landscaping and reprofiling reasons, and for the potential link road reasons. Or you've put that in as a link corridor concept. Now, my query in relation to, and I know that you've put in and you've provided additional evidence in relation to Greenbelt on these matters, and you've requested or you've asked that these areas be considered to be brought out of the Greenbelt as part of the site allocation. Now, I'm going to go to the council for a response on this, please, in whether you've looked at this and whether you can see in bringing forward the E11 proposals as set out in the policy, whether these additional pieces of land need to come out of the Greenbelt or whether they can go ahead anyway within the Greenbelt.
Thank you, Inspector. This has been the subject of discussion between ourselves and site promoter for quite some time. We understand their perspective and certainly their aim, I suppose, to eliminate any unnecessary risk when bringing forward the development in the long term. So it certainly is appreciated on our part, the proposal and the issue. I think broadly our view is, as we've been discussing in many of these sessions, in terms of making sure that the release of Greenbelt is shown to be justified and exceptional where required, is to focus on whether this is absolutely required in order to bring forward the development, and so to tightly draw around the area of development that we see as bringing forward the needs to meet local plan needs and bring forward employment growth in this location, so that the area lost in Greenbelt is minimised, essentially. Our view still at the moment is that the additional land being requested is not essential to bring forward these works. However, we are very sensitive to not wanting to restrict the development to come forward. I think our view is that this type of infrastructure, in terms of when it's complete, and that's the perspective by which we're looking at this situation, when this is all built out, to make sure that the Greenbelt boundaries that surround the development are robust and maintained defensible for the long term, and so as not to have wider areas of Greenbelt that are then landscaped or with infrastructure roads going through them in order to facilitate those when they are built out and they just then are outside of the greenbelt, effectively removing the protection that would thereby be had to having greenbelt there in the first place. So our view at the moment is that we do not think that they are required in order to bring forward the development.
Thank you. Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Madam. The issue here relates to some areas of land to the north of the enterprise site in the link corridor, to the south, the boundary to the south of the site, and also some areas to the east. And in those areas, my client's perspective is that the development will require mitigation to be provided. Mitigation, obviously, which is necessary to make a development acceptable in planning terms, is part and parcel of the development. So if once the view is reached that mitigation is part and parcel of that development, and that development is justified on the basis of exceptional circumstances in terms of releasing land from the greenbelt, and the mitigation that is necessary alongside it is also so justified. The simple position here is that landscaping and reprofiling is required, and my clients wish to ensure that the plan delivers policies that contain sufficient certainty for a decision maker to know how that landscaping and reprofiling should be treated in policy terms. And the concern is that leaving the areas that will be required for landscaping and reprofiling in the green belt will result in uncertainty as to the policy approach that should be applied, which affects the decision-making process in an unfortunate way, and a way which can be clarified and indeed addressed now. And so we ask, you've seen the arguments that are set out, the appraisal that's been done. I'm not going to spend time going over that now, but we say that in order to assist the deliverability of the enterprise park, it's crucial to ensure that appropriate landscaping mitigation can come forward on a basis which has a clear approach for decision makers in the future, and that's why we seek the changes that we do.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Council, do you wish to respond to Mr. Taylor?
I fully see the sense of that. Quite clearly, what we don't want is an allocation to be stymied by the need to obtain planning permission and show very special circumstances for works which are entirely, as it were, enabling of the particular allocation. So I suppose the question arises whether or not what needs to be done would amount to development which is inappropriate in greenbelt terms. So that's the essential issue. If it is inappropriate, then I see the force of Mr. Rubin's argument.
But the council's position at this stage is that you don't feel that it is necessary to come out of the greenbelt.
It depends what the nature of those works are. I think.
Could I ask you to get some clarity with Mr. Taylor? I'd rather do it outside the meeting.
Yeah, what I was going to suggest, Mom, is that we have that conversation party to party, so we have a good idea of whether or not there is a real likelihood that those works would constitute inappropriate development. Because that is not a situation we can countenance quite clearly. It puts a decision maker in a very difficult position subsequent to the plan being adopted.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, if you can work with the promoter and
we'll certainly do that. We'll provide you
with a note on
that.
That would be really useful. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're very happy to work on that basis too.
I'm glad to hear that. Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Now, I'm just going to run through my notes to just see if there is anything else that I need to ask on this site, because I don't particularly wish to come back to it. I want to move on to matter 10. And we come back. Mr. Warden, is there anything you wish to ask at this point?
No, thank you, Mrs. Wright.
Okay. Right. Unless anybody else has got anything they wish to add on in relation to site E11, then I'm proposing that we have a, is everybody happy with a 15-minute break? Everybody okay with that? So if we can come back at 5 to 4. My apologies that session has taken slightly longer. We may go slightly over 5 o'clock. I do apologise for that. But I just want to make sure that we have enough time to just do that. So if anybody comes back and they do need to leave early, if you can please let me know, then I can move the agenda around. Thank you. I'll be back here at 5:02. Thank you. Right. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back. Hope you can hear me again. Thank you. I'd like to move on now to, as I stated before we had the break, to policy E10 and Codham Hall Farm site. Now, I'm not proposing this to be a lengthy discussion at all, and I don't propose that we go over any elements that we've discussed in relation to transport issues that we've discussed for policy E11. So my questions, as well, if the council can start by just giving a short introduction to the site. I know it's an existing employment site and there's only a small element of land that's proposed to be allocated in addition to the existing employment site. So if the council can just give a very short introduction and then also give explain what the exceptional circumstances are for the removal of the site from the Greenbelt, that would be a good start. Thank you.
Thank you, Inspector. So yes, site E10 Codham Hall Farm is allocated, as you say, in the plan for an additional 0.61 hectares of employment land. The actual, obviously, the policy wording includes the existing employment uses. So as set out, it does mention obviously the full figure of 9.6 hectares of employment land, but obviously, as we've explained, the additional land that would be added to the net balance would be 0.61. The site itself, as obviously the other side of the road and northern side of A127 from the Brentwood Enterprise Park that we've just discussed. So it's situated to the north of the A127 with the M25 on the western boundary, western side of the site, sorry. And there is obviously in a sort of agricultural surroundings to the site. In terms of the exceptional circumstances for the site's release from the Greenbelt, our view is that the majority of the sites, as we say, represents existing employment use with a modest 0.61 hectares of additional land proposed. And so combined, the site is currently within the Greenbelt. The Greenbelt study assessed the site has a low, moderate impact on the Greenbelt. The site is bounded by existing natural features, strong natural features, and service roads, which would be reinforced with the proposed landscaping areas. And these particular specific local level characteristics are a factor that justifies selection of the site release from the Greenbelt.
Thank you very much. Now, our first question that we asked was in relation to just clarifying what was required, because I think where the confusion comes from is the actual policies map. Proposed changes to the policies map, which is set out in your document, as to, because you've got the site area, and then you've got the site boundary, and then you've got what is the Greenbelt, and then the amended Greenbelt. So I think that's where the clarity was needed. We weren't quite sure when you talk about the site area, is that the site allocation, or is the actual site allocation the site boundary? Now, from what, from the clarity that you've provided, it's all you're requesting as part of the plan is the employment site. So it's the 9.6 hectares is allocated. So that's the only part that's proposed to be removed from the Greenbelt. Is that correct? Yes. Okay. Good. That was my my reading of what I'd heard. Yes, the promoters, developers, owners of the site have access to additional land where they're proposing further landscaping works or whatever in relation to that. But that's not proposed to be, this is this 8 hectares that is set out in the submitted plan, but is proposed to be removed in your suggested amendments in your F9A. Can I just get some clarity on that? I haven't necessarily got any issues on the employment site itself. As I said, I've been there, I've had a look. In relation to this, the 8 hectares that is in the submitted plan, but you're proposing to take that out as part of the of your F9A suggested changes. Could you just clarify the implications of that? As in, does that then, because obviously I would have asked questions about, well, what does ancillary uses and other development within the Greenbelt, how does that fit with Greenbelt policy, etc., etc. So your removal of that from policy E10, is that to get rid of that that issue? Because you don't consider that any development would occur in that concept, or you would deal with that under very special circumstances rather than through that part of the site requiring allocation and removal from the Greenbelt.
Yes, so certainly the principle of the allocation boundary is to go around the majority of the existing employment uses on the sites, and obviously as part of that there is also an additional 0.61. The other area is purely from a point of view of in our position the needed for further landscaping works, which would be able to be carried out in any case, obviously, if that being remaining within the green belts, and therefore that wouldn't necessarily need to be specifically set out within the policy if it is not to be removed from the green belt.
So the necessity for the 0.61 hectares of additional employment land, can you just confirm to me the justification for that in this location, please?
Yes, certainly. So, I mean, in terms of the site, obviously there's opportunities by it being released from the Greenbelt as a whole in terms of any sort of potential remodelling that could take place on the site. And in terms of the boundaries, the way that the boundaries are drawn, there would have been some additional land as part of those boundaries. So that comes through the drawings of the boundaries themselves that were presented to us when the allocation was originally being proposed, or through the plan process, sorry. So the additional land is obviously as a consequence of that process, whereby it comes out of that requirement. So we're recognising that there is obviously the existing operations taking place on the site, but by drawing the boundaries the way that they are, that does, as a consequence, result in additional land coming forward as part of those boundaries.
And is that, I expect you know what I'm coming to, it's the necessity and the exceptional circumstances for the additional land, isn't it? And whether that is justified. It's where we drew the boundary isn't justification. So if you can just provide a bit more explanation as to what is that existing land now, and are you talking about it's several areas of land? It's not one piece of 0.61 hectares, or is it just general areas around the site where landscaping or other elements would occur, and that it's integral? Because I'm trying to understand the exceptional circumstances for the additional. I know it's only a small area, 0.61 hectares, but I'm trying to understand that's the reasoning for that, please.
Yes, I believe in terms of the boundary, it was obviously part of the overall site. I think there was some element to the southern side of the southeastern side, which is where that additional land did come forward, but it's bounded by internal service road. So in terms of the drawing of that boundary, it was to include that. But I think equally there was some additional, in terms of the total calculations that would come forward throughout the whole site. But I think from our point of view, the boundaries are justified and would accord with what's obviously as we've set it forwards. It's drawing the line around the operations that were taking place, and obviously they're justified on that basis.
I won't ask for it now, but you know what I'm going to say. I would like some more clarity on that. But that's going to be on a large majority of the Greenbelt sites anyway. So leave that to us so we give you some very clear directions as to exactly what we require on that. Thank you. Thank you on that. Now, in reading the hearing statement provided by S&J Padfield, excuse me, and again, I'm not going to go down the route of looking at emission sites, but there is a proposal that has been set out within the hearing statement, setting out requesting a wider release of additional land and that be removed from the greenbelt. Now, it's a significant area of land in addition to, in total, including the 9.61 that's proposed, or the 9.6 that's proposed. Just again, I'm not going to go down the route of discussing an emission site because that's coming out of the greenbelt, so that would not be acceptable unless it's justified and has already been put into the plan, etc. But is that necessary for delivering what's required from the plan and what the policy itself sets out?
No, it wouldn't be required in our view. It would just be additional land on top of what we've already proposed as an allocation.
Okay.
It wouldn't interact with that in that sense.
Okay, thank you. And if we can have a look at the wording of the policy itself. I'm not going to reiterate some points that we raised as part of E11. It's some of them are relevant to E10 as well in relation to the use of some of the wording. So you've added some wording in, instead of, again, you've got another local wildlife site here, a different one, Codham Hall Wood, which is adjacent to the site. But you now talk about preserving the setting of that local wildlife site, which is interesting wording. I'm trying to understand what that's trying to achieve.
I'm not sure.
Preserving the setting of a heritage asset, I fully understand.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could you just start? I'm just going to leave it with you and just have a look.
Leave it with me, because
there's
also an inappropriate crossing out there as well, and I'm not quite sure what's happened in translation. So I think there's something gone wrong when it was sent from me to the council. It doesn't look as if, or I may have got it wrong, but certainly I need to look at that. Looking at it now, I can see it's wrong. So leave it with me if you would.
That's fine. Okay, thank you for that. And then the preservation and, where possible, enhancement of the public right-of-way through the site. Can you just explain the reasoning behind that? I can understand the preservation of the public right-of-way. What do you mean by enhancement? And you do propose possible enhance.
Yeah.
I should say enhancement, but yeah.
Enhancement, yes, of course. Simply in terms of its utility. So as it's actually going through the designated site, we want to make sure that its utility is as good as it can possibly be for users of the footpath.
Okay.
I don't think it's going to impose anything onerous on the developers.
No. And the wording that proposed gives the flexibility.
Yes, absolutely.
But I'm sure the landowner appreciates on that point. Okay. Unless anybody has anything to mention, Mr. Taylor, please.
Thank you. I wonder if I just might make a couple of brief points in relation to E10 and the extent to which it will actually contribute to the objectives of the plan if it's constrained in the way that is proposed currently in the plan. Obviously, you're aware of the argument that's been presented by my clients for further changes to the Greenbelt boundary. The issue with this existing site is that it is one of those sites that addresses the needs of small to medium-sized firms seeking employment space. Those firms locate at the site and then they grow. As they grow, they have requirements for larger reconfigured floor space, which, because of the greenbelt nature of the site at present, can't be provided on the site. The exceptional circumstances case that the council's made to take the site out of the greenbelt is supported, but it doesn't go far enough to address the constraints that would enable the SMEs to stay on site. An SME that outgrows the site obviously has to move elsewhere, and when it moves elsewhere, it doesn't necessarily stay within the borough. And so by constraining the site in a way which doesn't allow for growth, for example, by providing additional land that would enable a site to a business to relocate temporarily whilst an existing area is reconfigured, there is a risk to the extent to which the site actually meets employment needs going forward. And so one of the points that's made in the hearing statement is that further changes to the greenbelt boundary are justified in order to retain sites, to retain SMEs on this site by providing the flexibility that's necessary to enable that. So that's really the sort of key point I wanted to get across.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Council response.
Yes,
please.
Ma'am. Our position is that the additional land relates to existing development, which is not the subject of an allocation in the existing plan, and of course is not the subject of a proposed allocation in the draft plan, and therefore it needs to be treated essentially as an emission site in that sense. So procedurally, it wouldn't be appropriate actually to extend the greenbelt boundary around it because it's not part of any proposal in this plan. That's the first point. Second point is, whilst we are sympathetic to the point being made, and in the sense that it is something that needs probably to be considered as part of the next review. And that being so, we need to discuss the propensity and the likelihood of the site contributing to further employment need and the flexibility of provision. So it would be appropriate to consider it in those circumstances, but unfortunately, we are constrained procedurally in my submission to the proposed, the proposal and not to the emission site.
Thank you, Mr. Shadaravian. Has anybody got any further comments they wish to make on policy E10? Because if not, I am proposing to move on to policy E12, which is Shoreditch Industrial Estate. I'll just get my papers up. So again, if I can start with the council, just giving an introductory, an introduction to the site. I recognise that part of it is already outside the green belt. That's my understanding. It's already an allocated site. So if the council could just provide an introductory element on the site and then set out how the additional element proposed to be, the additional land proposed to be removed from the green belt, what the exceptional circumstances for that are, please.
Thank you, Inspector. So yes, we're sort of in terms of the position where we are in the borough, we're moving slightly eastwards along the A127 from where we was just talking about. So we are, as I say, to the south of the borough, on the northern side of the A127. And the site itself, as you mentioned, is already an allocation within the 2005 local plan and out of the Greenbelt. That's the majority of the site. And in terms of what's being proposed for this plan, are some modest extensions to that site, to the northwest and to the south, and then the total size of the sites that would result would be 20.64 hectares of employment land. In terms of the surroundings, obviously, in terms of its access, the main access, it has its own dedicated road onto the A127, Childovich Hall Drive, which runs, so there is some land between that and the A127. In terms of the exceptional circumstances, if I come on to those, so the majority of site E10, as we mentioned, represents an existing employment use, and it's, I'm reading the wrong one there, apologies. So development site E12, comprises 2 extensions to an existing employment site already out of the Greenbelt. The Greenbelt study assessed that so the 2 parcels, as they were originally numbered, were 112D and 112E in the Healer, but they had a low and moderate impact on the Greenbelt. And whilst the extensions represent some further sprawl into the Greenbelt, this is limited by their small size and containment by established strong natural boundaries. And these particular specific local level characteristics are a factor that justifies selection of the site or sites released from the Greenbelt. And that's our view on the exceptional circumstances.
Thank you on that. Now, Mr. Butcher or Mr. Gibbs? It's Mr. Gibbs who's the Greenbelt. Is there anything you want to add on that in relation to exceptional circumstances, or anything further you want to add on Greenbelt before I sort of move on to other questions?
Yes, ma'am, thank you. We had on site 112D specifically, we noted a few minor inaccuracies within the Greenbelt assessment, in that the western edge of the site has a very strong, well-established landscape screen to the boundary, and the public footpath identified is actually without the parcel rather than within it. That has a slight knock-on effect to the assessment of Purpose 1 in the council's document. The net effect of that is that we still entirely agree with the assessment of the Greenbelt, and as Mr. Quilty has just said, we see that the assessment of parcel 1112D is making a low contribution to the Greenbelt, by nature of the fact that the southern parcel lies to the south of the existing site and is not as well enclosed as Range North. It necessarily has a slightly higher contribution to the Greenbelt, and makes a moderate contribution to the Greenbelt. The boundary of parcel 1112E is defined on the southern edge by a recently planted tree line.
In relation to what you've just said about Purpose 1, does that, in your assessment or in your view, change the sort of low contribution?
No, ma'am, it was really just a part of the exercise of going through the review of the Greenbelt assessment. The actual result that arrives at the end is the same as the council's.
It's the same, okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Again, like some of the other sites, we will be asking for further information on that, but we will be coming to that later on and just requesting some further information in writing from the council, so they may well come back and come to the supporters of the site for any additional information. So, but I'm not proposing to go through that now because we need to give clear direction as to exactly what what further evidence we wish the council to provide. So I suppose this is where I will come to a very similar question that I've asked on some of the other sites, particularly in relation to is this the expansion of this site necessary in relation to the employment uses on there? And I have visited the site, I have seen the site. And again, does that fit in with the exceptional circumstances in relation to, is it absolutely necessary for this site to expand in and utilise those areas of land that are proposed to be removed from the greenbelt, so that gives some form of justification for the exceptional circumstances that are required? So I don't know if the council wants to respond on that first, and then if Mr. Gibbs or Mr. Butcher need to respond as well.
Yeah.
So Mr. Quilt, please.
Thank you, Inspector. So yes, in respect to this site, I mean, similar, obviously, nature to what was just described earlier, but the site offers the opportunity for expansion and improvement in connection with the existing site. So the boundaries of those extensions are, as we sort of mentioned, well contained, and in terms of their connection to the existing employment site, they'll be well related in our view. And I think just relating back to the discussion that we had in respect of West Horndon Industrial Estate. Obviously, as I mentioned in that session, we can't be sure of direct links of specific users, but by all means, in terms of the strategy that we're trying to approach, is to make sure that we're meeting obviously, we're taking account of loss of employment sites in terms of their redevelopment and the re-provision of improved or new sites in the borough, so that can provide opportunities for users and better choice in the area. And obviously, this site does make up part of the southern corridor in terms of the growth corridor that we have identified in the strategy, and that fits within that really in terms of the corridor of residential and employment uses that are coming forward, and obviously complementing that would be this site.
Is there are there any existing uses on that? I mean, is this just vacant land at the moment, as in undeveloped land, or are there actually some uses on there at present? It seemed to me when I went on site, there seemed to be some uses actually within the proposed allocated the proposed areas that are to be removed from the greenbelt, but please correct me if I'm wrong on that. Can I just clarify? I'm talking about the site as you enter the site and drive up, and the site on the left, so sort of opposite Shoreditch Hall. That area is there existing? Does that form part of the parcel of land that's proposed to be removed from the greenbelt?
Yes, that's correct, Inspector. So yeah, as I'll let Mr. Butcher come into the details of the existing operational uses there, but as I understand it, there are some uses on that land. I think those particular buildings they formed part of the farm complex as it originally was many years ago, but there are some uses on there, but I won't necessarily go any further into the details. I'm sure Mr. Butcher will be able to provide more clarification on that. But in terms of the other parcel, the one to the northwest, that by all means is vacant, and of course the parcel we just talked about, there is an additional area to the south of that which currently isn't in use, and which would form part of that extension as well.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Butcher, do you want to add anything to that?
Just very briefly, if I may, Ma'am. The buildings on the left-hand side as you enter the estate have long been established now as in employment use. So the council have taken the pragmatic response of including those as part of the allocation for employment at Shoreditch. So I think their approach here has been quite properly to recognise that those buildings are now in employment use, whereas many years ago they were agricultural. Probably at the time the original local plan was drawn up, and things have moved on quite a lot since then. And as I say, they're now pretty well all in employment use, and it just makes sense that the allocation reflects, as far as that area is concerned, the allocation reflects those uses. Thank you.
Thank you for the clarity. Can we have a look at the actual policy wording? So, and then the outstanding matter, which relates to the policy, that's highlighted in the statement of common ground, please. So what's set out in E12 in the submitted plan, the council has made suggested changes in F9A. And then on the back of that, if Mr. Butcher could confirm that the outstanding matters, do they relate to any aspect within the proposed policy itself, or the general issues in relation to heritage impact and potential heritage impact?
Ma'am, as I understand it, and it may be Mr. Quilter can confirm on this, the request for a heritage reference within the policy derived from the comments of Heritage England, and we're not entirely convinced that they actually looked at the site or indeed its setting in order to suggest such a policy. We said in our statement of common ground, and that's, I think, acknowledged by the council, that the reality here is that there aren't any heritage assets that would be impacted upon by the two sites, the two open area sites, if you like, that form part of the proposed allocation. And we feel it is unnecessary for that to be included as part of the policy for E12. Part of an assessment of any development management process and a planning application, if necessary. This is a matter that could be addressed at that stage, but certainly in policy terms, we don't see it as being a necessary addition to the policy here, and it may be, and I'm hoping that Mr. Quilter can confirm what I've said. Thank you.
Can I have a response from the council? So is it Mr. Quilter?
Yes, thank you.
Confirm the reasoning for the addition in
so
F9A.
yes, in terms of the that statement Mr. Butcher's relayed to you, that is correct. Obviously, in terms of what we've had back from Historic England, in terms of what they've set out as what they have requested as part of the policy, that there is a request for a heritage statement to be provided with the application. But I think, as we discussed earlier this morning, obviously, it's whether there's a more stipulation about, I think it was in relation to Nags Head Lane site, whether we need to have a specific mention as to which heritage asset that may relate to.
Is there a specific heritage asset that it should relate to?
We've not been advised of what that is, so I think we've obviously just been provided the request to have that as a part of the policy wording. That's why we've reflected that, but we can provide that further clarification.
I think
if you could, that would be very useful. If you could provide that clarification, please.
I think we need to go back to Heritage England and just find out exactly what it is they're concerned about, and then we could be more specific in the policy if there is a need to be.
Absolutely, and if it's justified, then yes, it can stay in. But if it's not justified,
then it comes up. Yeah.
We can consider that. Thank you very much.
Yes, and Ma'am, if I could just add to that, this is a matter that we did touch on in a bit more detail within our hearing statement in terms of how these sites sit in relation to any nearby heritage assets. So I trust that the council will take that in, bear those comments in mind when they go back to Historic England. Thank you.
Yes, you do prefer you do make mention of Grade 2 listed houses, etc., and undeveloped land at Range North, etc. So you do make mention of that. So as long as the discussions involve that, that would be very useful to get some clarity on there. Are there any other questions, Mr. Butcher, that you wish to raise in relation to the policy, particularly in relation to F9A and the suggested wording changes that the council has put forward? Obviously, we ourselves as inspectors will be looking at giving scrutiny to those to wording as they come forward. But is there anything else that you wanted to raise?
No, Ma'am. I think I'm hoping in many respects that the session was can be quite brief. The issues that we were raised in general within our hearing statements, I think, have since that time been clarified and cleared up through the statement of common ground and the communications and discussions that we've had with Mr. Quilter and his team. So I'm confident that we're in a place now that we're pretty well clear on everything, and in terms of the approach to policy, with the exception, obviously, of the matter that we have just touched on.
Thank you. That helps to give clarity. So thank you for that. Well, if there's nothing else on policy E12, I am proposing to move on now to our final policy for today. So I can't see, there's no other hands up. There's not many of us in the room now. So can I then move on to policy E13, please? Let me just get everything up that I need for this one. Right. And again, if we can start with the council just giving a very short introduction to the site and its inclusion within the plan. I recognise it's got planning permission, but obviously it's in the Greenbelt, and I recognise the council wishing to continue with the allocation. That makes perfect sense if obviously it's justified from a Greenbelt exceptional circumstances position. Obviously, you've obviously have found very special circumstances to give it planning permission, but that's a different kettle of fish. So we won't go down that route. So if the council could just give an introduction, please, and again, just go down the route of the exceptional circumstances, because I know that is something that that may need to be discussed.
Yes, thank you, Inspector. So yes, the site of East Horndon Hall E13 is situated on the junction, or on the corner of the junction of the A128, A127, otherwise known as Halfway House. The land is, in terms of its current or the existing uses, there are some uses on the northern part of the site, which would represent some brownfield land. The rest of the site is greenfield land. It is bounded by effectively the old Tilbury Road on the western boundary, and I say new, it's probably quite old by itself, but the A128 on the eastern boundary with the A127 to the north. So it forms a triangle of land in between those key road pieces of infrastructure. In terms of the surroundings, there is some more recently there has been some redevelopment on the opposite side of the Tilbury Road, Elliott's Close. So there's some residential dwellings there, and that was given permission obviously by the council at the time. And in terms of the exceptional circumstances of the site for its release from the Greenbelt, so the development of the site was assessed in the Greenbelt study as having a moderate impact on the Greenbelt, and whilst the site would represent a new employment site, as mentioned, it does contain a portion of previously developed land to the north. And as described, the site is bounded by the A127, A128 and Tilbury Road on its three boundaries. And this proposal would not lead to any encroachment with surrounding towns, villages, with separation being maintained. And it's felt that these particular specific local level characteristics are a factor that justifies its selection of the site being released from the Greenbelt.
Thank you. Thank you very much on that point. Does anybody wish to raise any comments in relation to the exceptional circumstances? Mr. Harding, please.
Apologies, I was having trouble unmuting myself.
That's okay. It's getting late. Don't worry about it.
This parcel of land only really came into the development plan in about 2018. It hadn't been considered at all before that stage, and I think it only really came on the council's radar because a planning application was submitted in respect of it. Now, it has then, since it came on the radar, been fast-tracked with little really understanding on the local community's part as to why. You're right in saying that it has outline planning permission. The circumstances under which it got outline planning permission are a grave concern to the local residents. I won't go through the history, or too much of the history, but it failed on its first application, and on its second application it received 6 votes for, 6 votes against. The chair of the planning committee chose to use her veto and casting vote, and on that basis the submission was submitted to the Secretary of State to get the outline planning permission. Now, to achieve that, there had to be exceptional circumstances given as to why it should be removed from the Greenbelt. Those special circumstances were stated as 1, significant economic and sustainability benefits, and 2, that no alternative sites were available within the borough. Now, I would suggest to you that the first benefit or circumstance, significant economic and sustainable, if I could say the word, sustainability benefits, would apply to any site. Any site will show you significant economic and sustainability benefits if it's allowed to develop. And the fact, second one, I would say is not true. There are a number of alternative sites available within the borough. Indeed, strangely enough, on the day we wrote to the council about this particular site, the same developers submitted a planning application for a commercial site within the north of the borough to be redeveloped as a housing, luxury housing development. So there's one commercial site that we can point to straight away that was available. We were really disappointed to discover that the Secretary of State, when the matter was referred to him, chose not to intervene, and indeed he passed the matter straight back to the Borough Council. So in effect, the chair of the Planning and Licensing Committee had 3 votes on this planning application to ensure that outline planning permission was granted. There are a number of reasons why the Parish Council believes this allocation is not necessary. As discussions so far this afternoon have indicated, there are 5 industrial estates either in West Horndon Parish or on the borders of West Horndon Parish that had vacancies at the present moment in time, and the Borough Council under the development plan 3 of them they are proposing to enlarge. If there's no demand for jobs at the present moment, where will the demand for jobs materialise here at the present time? There doesn't seem to be any justification for this site being included. I know from viewing previous sessions of the public hearing that there have been comments made about flooding at this particular site. I don't wish to sort of dwell on those, but at the present moment in time, this is fenland. It is used largely as pasture land for horses at the present moment in time. There is a very small, about 10% of the land that is brownfield. The rest is greenbelt. It largely acts as a floodplain. I know swimming pools are closed at the moment, but if anyone would care to put their swimming trunks on, I could take you over there and we could all have a swim. It acts as a flood defence to the village of West Hongdon in the sense that it absorbs a large amount of surface water, and if the site is developed, there are serious question marks about where that water will go. There is an application in at the present moment in time by a company to take the development on to its second stage in terms of placing one unit there, one major unit there at the present moment in time on the northern part of the site. It is being heard at the present moment in time. There are a large number of objections that have been submitted in respect to it. Inevitably, the parish council is one of them, but one of the other more interesting objections, or I don't want to call it an objection, that's unfair, a statement that has been placed in by Essex Water or Essex County Council and the Flood Defence, is that there needs to be thorough discussion about the sites because of the surface water issues, because it acts as a flood defence, and more importantly, it provided much needed protection to West Hongdon when West Hongdon was flooded in 2012, and it limited the level of flooding of properties that occurred. There are a number of other reasons why we would object to the site being used for industrial development, but probably I've gone beyond already, and thank you for allowing me to speak. I've gone beyond just talking about the special circumstances that existed for taking the property out of the Greenbelt.
No, that's absolutely fine, Mr. Harding. If you wish to continue and bring up all the points that you would like to raise in relation, you're more than welcome to do that now.
Okay, as I say, there are a number of reasons that have been put forward as to why the property should no longer be considered. As you have heard earlier on, sorry, I'm scrambling around in papers here.
That's okay, just take your time.
As you have heard earlier on, this uses the A127 corridor, which a number of the other proposed industrial developments that we've discussed this afternoon also are proposing to use. The A127 is already a saturated network. At peak times, traffic is slow moving, if moving at all. So this is yet another development that will cause congestion on the roadway. The land also falls within the Thames Chase boundary, and Brentwood are a signatory to that agreement. So they are not honouring their agreement in terms of maintaining Thames Chase as an area to enjoy. And because of where the land is situated, it is almost a certainty that the way in which people will be gaining access to the site will all be vehicle based rather than any other form of transport. It doesn't have bus links at the present moment in time. There is a local bus service, very sporadic, that provides some form of transport, about 6 buses a day, something like that.
Because I did notice when I was up on site, there are some bus stops in the locality, but you're saying that the bus service is not very good.
You get about six buses a day. No special concession made for rush hour or anything like that. And they largely run north to south within the borough, from West Horndon Station to Brentwood itself. The access road, the old Tilbury Road, as has been mentioned, does not have any public footpaths at the present moment in time, and that, once people got off of the buses on the A128, would be how they would walk to the site and gain access if they were using public transport. And it may be a minor point. Mention was made of the new Elliott's Close development, housing development. That is on the site of an old petrol station and nightclub. There are around 27 properties that were built 12 months ago, 18 months ago, something like that. Their whole environment and character of the properties they built totally changed because there was no knowledge of this land being developed for industrial job purposes. I don't know if there's any other questions you wanted to ask me.
Not at the moment. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the council to respond to the points that you've raised, Mr. Harding, and then if there's anything else we need to query, then we'll do so. So thank you very much for that. Mr. Quilter, please, can you respond to the points that Mr. Harding's raised?
Yes, thank you, Inspector. So yes, so obviously as Mr. Harding's outlined, there obviously was a process by which the application was determined. I guess the difference that we're talking about today is the position of allocation of the site and its removal from the greenbelt. As we've already mentioned, that there's a difference between the very special circumstances which are particular to that application and the exceptional circumstances for its actual removal from the greenbelt as part of the allocation within the plan. And obviously we've outlined our position in terms of the justification for that, so we don't change that position. I think in respect of the points on flooding, clearly an important matter. We recognise that obviously it's something that has been assessed through the plan in terms of the potential impact on flooding. And equally, we obviously consult with the statutory bodies of the Environment Agency and Essex County Council as the local flood authority in respect of the proposed allocation. And there was no significant concerns raised in respect of that site being identified. So we've, and I suppose the other thing is also to note is in the F9A document, we've got the additional paragraph being proposed and just to follow from paragraph 9.224 in the plan in respect of obviously the appropriate assessments that need to be taken place, or any mitigations that may need to be taken place on the site in respect of sustainable drainage. I didn't want to muddle between the two there. Obviously, in terms of the application, that's in terms of its reserved matters, obviously that's subject to ongoing discussions that would need to be worked through in terms of those consultation with the respective bodies. But in terms of the plan, there's appropriate measures we feel in place to refer to that on that side of things. I think in terms of the level of demand, obviously we have to recognise the particular points in time there will be fluctuations in the market. I appreciate obviously Mr. Harding will have on the ground knowledge in terms of where he will obviously see and know what's going on in terms of the locality on a day-to-day basis. But from the point of view of what we're proposing and what we're trying to deal with as a plan, we're obviously looking over the longer term, and obviously we recognise there will be fluctuations over that time. But we are ultimately trying to meet a specified need within the plan. So we're taking account of, as mentioned earlier, the potential loss, or if subject to the plan being approved, but the loss of existing employment sites such as that in West Horndon, and we're making sure that overall there is we are meeting those needs and taking account of those losses, and that's set out within our evidence in terms of the Economic Futures report in terms of those demands. So clearly that's our reference point really when it comes to determining obviously making sure we're meeting those needs. And obviously the other point that was raised in terms of the concentration of employment sites along the A127 corridor, as we was talking earlier, in terms of obviously the Enterprise Park makes up the majority of that in terms of additional land, and we've obviously gone through the discussion already in terms of its situation, its location on a key junction, and how that links to the proposed uses and its appropriateness there. And in terms of the other sites, we're talking about an expansion of Childerditch Industrial Estate, as we just discussed. And obviously with East Horndon Hall, let's not forget also with regards to the plan, there will be a relationship between that site and the proposals for Dunton Hills Garden Village as well. So there certainly will be complementary elements of that in terms of the improvements that can be made in respect of public transport, as we've just mentioned. Obviously, that's part of the wider improvements that need to take place to accommodate growth across the corridor, and recognising obviously there will be changes that need to be made to accommodate future growth, both from a new housing point of view, but equally obviously the employment and how people move between those. I think that's the main points covered, but apologies if I've missed anything there. If there is, I can pick up on those points.
The issue raised about access to the site in terms of its sustainability. Can you, and the point that Mr. Harding made about that most people to the site will travel by car. There are bus stops on the A128, I recognise that, and so does Mr. Harding, but it's a very limited bus service. Can you just, sorry, you might have responded to that, but could you just clarify?
That's fine. I think the key thing is there is probably the linkages in terms of the wider growth that's going to be taking place and the improvements that can come forward as part of the Dunton Hills proposals. Clearly, obviously, as part of the site in individual terms, there'll be a need to consider what can be provided in terms of the any improvements to bus stops and so forth. But I think the key thing is that wider growth that will bring forward those benefits that will be part of.
And how does that work in terms of the difference in potential timescales of delivery? I mean, could you give me an update on the delivery of this site in terms of its planning status and the reserve matters?
Yes, certainly. Yeah, so as say, the outline permission has been granted. There's the reserve matters, which I understand is being considered, as already been mentioned. So that's a very specific date, but I think it will be in the short term this year that will be resolved in terms of those reserve matters.
So is anything being considered in relation to travel to and from that site in the intervening period should Dunton Hills come forward later? Because there would be a gap, wouldn't there? If you're talking about there would be an interlink between Dunton Hills, because obviously it's immediately adjacent. It's just across the road of Tilbury Road on the A128. I'm trying to understand what would happen in the intervening period. Are you saying that in the intervening period, people would travel by car?
Well, certainly, I think there will be obviously car use coming into the site. I think there is obviously the need to there has been a need to look at what opportunities there are, at least I think from the responses that have been given. I don't know if Mr. Johnson's put his hand up there, so he may be able to give more information from the Highway Authority perspective.
Oh, that would be useful, yes.
It might be me going any further there and probably saying the wrong thing. So if I'll let Mr. Johnson come in.
Thank you, Mr. Quilter. I'll bring in Mr. Johnston and then I'll come to Ms. Williams. Mr. Johnston, please. And then I will come to Mr. Harding again. Mr. Johnston?
Excuse me. Obviously, I was on mute.
I couldn't see you, so I couldn't see you talking. So,
excuse me. Yes, thank you. Just I was saying the original application was a very long process in terms of highways. We must have spent at least 18 months, I should think, going through that process. It eventually got refused on reroute grounds and such like, and then a new application came in, and as we know, it got approved. Basically, the situation is they've come for the whole suite of improvements, which eventually appeased the Highway Authority, including major junction improvement on the old Tilbury Road with the new Tilbury Road, the A128, the Station Road junction with the A128 as well. There's new footways going in, widened existing footways, new bus stops going in. These are all part of the conditions of the approval. What do I add? Because of, obviously, as Mr. Quilter pointed out, there's it's obviously going to be next to Dunton Hills, and it will benefit significantly from all the facilities and services that would provide. But on those bases, what the situation with the highway improvements is that it's a sort of either-or situation. What they've done is they costed the improvements that they would provide. So we don't want a situation where they would put in nice new junctions for us, and then of course 5 seconds later they'd be sort of torn up again because of Dunton Hills. So what they've done is they costed it, so that we know the costs, and they would make those contributions towards a wider improvements, which would include the Dunton Hills improvements. So that's the situation. We don't want to obviously have a double load of roadworks going on along there. We might have to. It might mean a bit of pain in the short term, but there will be long-term gain. So. Yes, on the basis of the fact that they provided, as I say, a significant suite of improvements, highway improvements, we eventually recommended approval of the application.
Thank you for that update, Mr. Johnston. Can I bring in Ms. Williams, please, and then I'll come to Mr. Harding after that.
Thank you. It's probably worth touching on a couple of those points that have been raised. In relation to sort of the delivery of the site and bringing it forward, it's now been acquired by Goodmans, who are bringing forward the site for development, and they are the party that have submitted the phasing condition. Just as a matter of clarity, I don't think the reserve matters have been submitted. The phasing condition is still being determined by the authority. But it is their intention to submit reserve matters as soon as possible this year. Like officers have said, there are a series of mitigation measures included within the outline permission, which will deal with an interim sort of scenario before Dunton comes forward. But as Brendan described them as a suite of highways sort of improvements or mitigation measures that make the scheme acceptable. In terms of flooding, I'd just note that obviously the lead local flood authority did not object to the outline planning application, subject to conditions which were applied to the outline. I think that probably covers the deliverability point.
Great, thank you very much for that. Thank you. Mr. Harding, please. You're on mute, Mr. Harding.
That's cleared it.
That's it. I can hear you now.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to remember all the points that have been made and come back with some answers. Yes, we have seen the improvements to the A128 that would provide access to this site, and indeed the improvements to the A128 that are proposed in respect to the Dunton Hills Garden development. Now, I take the point fully on board. Person made, yes, it will involve a lot of works on the A128. It can't all be done at once, so therefore there will be time lags between transport improving to the site and obviously the situation being rectified. However, it doesn't take away from the point that I first made. These are road improvements that they are making, so therefore the access to the site will largely still be vehicular. The site is a fairly substantial distance from the railway station, at least a mile and a half. People who are living on the Elliott's Close development at the moment do not walk to the station, they use cars. Much as I would love to think that we will encourage people to use bikes, bicycles, very few of the people up at Elliott's Close are actually using bicycles to get to the station. They use their cars as well to drive to the station. I applaud the initiative to try and get other forms of transport being used and our own forms of transport in terms of feet. But unfortunately, I don't think it's going to happen. The second point regarding the Water Authority didn't object to the original application. No, they didn't. And the reason they didn't, and we have had subsequent discussions with them, is they had incomplete data, which they now accept they had incomplete data. They didn't, believe it or not, as a water authority, they did not know that our village flooded in 2012. And they have now accepted that the data they hold is incomplete, and they would revise their advice that was originally given, which is why I made the statement that in response to the present planning application that is going through the council's planning office, Essex Flood Defence Authority have agreed that there should be much further investigation regarding the surface water problem in this part of the borough. And the other point that I believe was made by Mr. Quilter about we should be looking at this site as complementing Dunton Hills Garden Village. I would suggest, given that Dunton Hills Garden Village also has its own planned light industrial units and other employment opportunities, that rather than complement, it could work against this site.
Thank you, Mr. Harding. Can I ask the council to respond to Mr. Harding's points, if you wish to?
Thank you, Inspector. I think our view still stands that we've obviously, including Dunton Hills, we understand that we'll bring forward some employment uses, that there is obviously the demand for that based on our evidence, and so therefore it seemed deemed appropriate to bring forward development in that location.
Can we move on to just look at the actual policy wording? So, subject to us finding that there are exceptional circumstances, and we keep this policy in the plan. How would this policy now be utilised in relation to the reserved matters element of the submission, and does it fit with that? Because obviously this already has outline planning permission, so it already can, subject to gaining reserved matters, build. That's not our purpose here to take that away or anything. Our purpose is to see whether the allocation itself is sound. So in relation to the wording that you've put forward in terms of the changes in F9A, are you confident that that wording is appropriate for the context in which it would be used in the plan?
Thank you, Inspector. Yes, I think our view is that there wouldn't be an incompatibility, obviously, with what's coming forwards. Is broadly and it is in line with what's being set out within the these proposed changes. I think, obviously, in terms of the appreciating that some of these points maybe will be covered in the reserved matters, I suppose, in terms of details. But I think, obviously, these are more broad principles that we're trying to apply, recognising that the site is going to be delivering employment land, which is what the main thrust of that policy is.
I think, Ma'am, if I may, the detailed proposals would have to respect the requirements of paragraph 1. Improves those sustainable links are in fact walking and cycling links and should be specified as such. Other elements there also need to be complied with in building up the details of the proposals. So it retains relevance at reserve matter stage.
Thank you. Are there any? I haven't got any further questions. Is there anything further that anybody wishes to comment on in relation to policy E13? No, I can't see any hands up. Okay. Well, that comes to the end of this session. So thank you very much for everybody's participation. We'll certainly go away and think about a number of the points that have been raised and for us to consider. We're back on tomorrow morning with, let me just make sure I've got the right session. Make sure I got the right week, to be fair. We're back on matter 7D, which is Shenfield, and then in the afternoon we have a consideration of Ingatestone and the proposed site allocations in there. So without further ado then, unless there's anything else that anybody wants to add, Mr. Warden, anything you wish to add? No?
No.
I'd like to thank everybody again. Thank you for your participation, and we look forward to seeing everybody again in the morning at 9:30. So
thank you, Ma'am.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.